I'm Eileen Kelly, and you're listening to the Going Mental podcast. On today's episode, I am joined by Dr. Francis Lee. He is the Psychiatrist-in-Chief at New York Presbyterian Hospital and the co-director of the Center for Youth Mental Health. Dr. Francis Lee is an accomplished neurobiologist and psychiatrist studying the molecular basis of mood and anxiety disorders with the goal of understanding why many of them emerge during the transition from childhood to adolescence. Dr. Lee earned his bachelor degree with the highest honors from Princeton University and his medical degree and doctorate from the University of Michigan, followed by a psychiatry residency at the Payne Whitney Clinic at New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medical Center. He has served on several panels and boards at the National Institutes of Health and the National Mental Health Foundation and has received numerous honors and awards, including the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers and the Burroughs Wellcome Clinical Scientist Award. He has also published nearly 100 original studies in peer-reviewed journals and completed nearly 30 reviews. Today's episode is brought to you by Litter Robot. My dear cat parents and cat listeners, we know that you're obsessed with your cat. Admit it. If I looked at your camera roll, 90% of your photos are going to be of your cat, and I don't judge you. In fact, a few minutes ago, I was sitting on the floor taking a video of my cat Chi-Chi's little toe beans and the fluffy fur that grows between them. I would truly do anything for my cat. I would let my cat take out a loan in my name, and I want him to have the very best. But if you're being honest, is it difficult for you to keep your cat's litter box clean? So that's where Litter Robot comes in. Litter Robot is the solution to all your litter box issues, so you never have to scoop again. It has self-cleaning technology that automatically cleans it after every use. So for me, I sleep at my boyfriend's house multiple nights a week, and I can't tell you how nice it is to come home and the litter has scooped itself, and I don't have those smells wafting around or have to clean the litter box when I get home. It's already clean for me on the nights that I don't sleep at home with my cat. And get this, Litter Robot will send you notification to your phone when it needs to be emptied, as well as give you data and insights to stay on top of your cat's health. So how many times they're peeing and just making sure they're actually using the litter box and, they don't have a UTI or any health issues. It really doesn't get any easier than this. And I think everyone needs one. If you have a cat, just makes your life so much easier. So join over 1 million happy pets and pet parents who've upgraded to Litter Robot. What are you waiting for? As a special offer to listeners of the show, go to stopscooping.com/goingmental and enter promo code GOINGMENTAL to save an extra $50 off any Litter Robot bundle. So that's an extra $50 off any Litter Robot bundle at stopscooping.com/goingmental and enter promo code GOINGMENTAL at checkout. Stopscooping.com/goingmental and enter promo code GOINGMENTAL. Well, welcome to the show, Dr. Lee. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for inviting me to the show.
Do you mind introducing yourself for my listeners in
Sure.
your own words?
Yes, so I'm a neuroscientist and also a psychiatrist, and I currently am the research co-director for a tri-institutional center called the Center for Youth Mental Health at New York Presbyterian Hospital. And I'm also the psychiatrist-in-chief of New York Presbyterian Hospital on the Weill Cornell campus.
And you are incredibly accomplished. Can you tell me a little bit about your life growing up, maybe your family and their relationship to mental health?
Yes. I'll start by saying that as I think about it, I'm just extraordinarily lucky. I have had many lucky breaks in my life. The one that I think is most relevant is that in high school, I went to the local college and looked for a summer job. And it turned out that I got a job at a neuroscience lab at this local college. And it just turned out that my local college was Princeton University. So I got to work in high school in a world-class neuroscience lab that was studying amazingly, this is the 1980s, the levels of neurotransmitters in the brains of rats that were actively moving and doing other things. It was just, I had never known that this field of investigation existed, and I was just hooked. And I basically, to make a long story short, I worked that summer I eventually continued to work for 4 more years in that same lab.
Because you went to
Yeah,
Princeton.
because I went to Princeton afterwards. And then um, my identity as a neuroscientist was sort of like sort of set. And it sort of relates to what we're going to be discussing. Uh, this was like a sensitive period or critical period of my own prefrontal cortical development. And my prefrontal cortex was ready to take in all this information. And I just was able to just soak it all up. And I really thought that this was my trajectory. And I did really well and everything like that. And then I went to medical school, and this I learned two major lessons in medical school. The one that was first, I went and did my rotation in psychiatry, and I loved it. I found that patients would come in, they would be very depressed or very anxious. We would give them medications or psychotherapy. And then, again, this is 1980s. In a couple weeks, they got better. And I actually got to see that sort of progression from severe debilitating illness to someone. And also, we have, in addition to medications, we have psychotherapy. We also have neuromodulation. Even back then, we had electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, and people got better. And the way I thought about it was just that as a neuroscientist, this is a great field to go into. You have three different modalities you can mix and match, and the future is open for doing anything to try to address sort of treating brain disorders. The second lesson I learned in medical school was that in addition to getting an MD, I got a PhD. So in my PhD, I failed. I published 0 papers as a PhD student. I was in the
Interesting.
bottom of my MD PhD class. And again, I was in my early 20s by then. Again, my prefrontal cortex is still growing and developing. And I learned for the first time what it felt like not succeeding. And the reason why that was so important to learn for me was that I realized that feeling goes away. But I learned that very early on. And for 4 years during my PhD, I did not succeed. And the fact that I made it through the program, and then I did well in my residency and my postdoctoral fellowship, and everything worked out. But I to this day, I'm extraordinarily grateful for everything that has happened, just because I don't take it for granted.
I was gonna say, do you feel like it gave you an additional perspective working with patients? Not everything just went perfect and
Exactly, because
the
like
right path.
if you go online and look at descriptions of me, you'll see that I just checked a bunch of boxes. But what I think I picked up, and I think this is what I also am thinking about these days about how to think about mental illness, is that there is this other component, not just of disease, but also of resilience. How
Right.
do you not, everyone will always have setbacks. It's actually much more important to figure out how to get over the setback. There's, just to give you a sort of small neurobiological correlate, anytime there is a stress, like for example, if you're walking across the street and you almost get hit by a car, your cortisol levels in your body are going to go up and your amygdala is going to go off. And that's the normal body response, and then it's supposed to go down immediately. And so the body is always ready to sort of handle stress. It's when you don't sort of metabolize that stress correctly and lets cortisol levels stay too high or something, so that it is sort of a natural part of life to be stressed and overcome it. And but I think that what I can say from my upbringing is, by going through that when the stakes were quite relatively low, I was able to recover and get a residency and start my academic career. But it allowed me to see what it felt like, and know that I could recover also.
And probably relate to your patients.
And also, I also relate to all my trainees. Every time there is a setback, I sort of tell them, yes, this happens, but papers get rejected, grants get rejected, but you can always write another paper or write another grant.
And so what about your family? Like, I'm interested, what did your parents do? Are they
Yeah.
doctors? What was the relationship to mental health like in your household growing up? Or the
I came from an
conversations?
Asian American family, and we did not talk about mental health. Yeah, so and I think to this day it is something that is still not something that my generation of my parents really sort of took to heart. But just to but I grew up in a fairly boring middle class New Jersey suburb. But the only story I'll tell is that as so my father's an engineer, my mother is a realtor. Um, but in like lots of immigrant Americans, they had a side business. They ran a laundromat, and my two older brothers, and I had to work there over the summers. And I can just tell you, I did not like working there. And so, at some point, this was actually the more mundane reason why I got that job at Princeton University. I wanted to get out of working in the laundromat, and so, but I knew that if I told my Asian American parents that I got a summer job at Princeton University and I couldn't work in the laundromat, they would let me do that. And all I had to tolerate though was the enduring resentment of my two older brothers who still had to work at the laundromat. To this day, they remember that. So, but anyway, I would say that they were. But what I gained from them is that um, again, their emphasis on education and ultimately they did accept that I am, even though they did not understand the sort of the field of psychiatry, that they basically appreciated that I was doing something try to move the field forward. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Very
yeah,
fascinating. I always love to talk to people about
yeah,
their trajectory and just how they got. I mean, listen, like the brain, its
yeah.
emotions, it's like really what makes people tick, the
It,
field of
it probably is the
psychiatry.
most complicated organ in the body. And this is where I think just to sort of set expectations, I think we think that we can solve things in the brain and we can get things, and it's so complicated. And I think that it will take, a much longer time and to basically sort of crack the code per se, whether it be, remember in the era of the way they cracked the DNA code, or now they figured out how to make a virus using RNA. These things are amazing advances in science, but I think we'll need this extra level to get to something as complex as the brain. Yeah, yeah,
So I want to talk a little bit about your work
yeah,
specifically among
yeah,
adolescents.
yeah,
And so, no doubt there's a mental health
yeah,
epidemic today.
yeah,
When I was preparing for our interview, I read that even before the pandemic, anxiety and depression among children and adolescent increased 27% and 24%, respectively, from 2016 to 2019. I want to ask you why you think that is, and what about our society today is contributing to that.
yeah. That's a great question. And I can say the bottom line is we don't know. But I will say that what's interesting is even by 2007, the actual rates of suicide attempts and were actually going down. It was interesting. I was talking to a group of child psychiatrists back then. They thought that they had sort of like were able to sort of they had this under control, and then around 2008 it started to go up, and then by 2011 to 12, as you noted, it started to really rise. And there are again multiple factors, but I think I've been reading a lot about Jonathan Haidt and his new book, The Anxious Generation. But he makes an interesting point that around 2010-11 was when the first front-facing cameras came out from Apple, the iPhone 4, and that essentially when and the whatever and Instagram was bought up by Facebook, and you were able to post your own pictures online. And I think we can never sort of underestimate the impact of that sort of technological sort of change, not just because of the social media components, but just to think about throughout evolution, the human brain was wired to see static images, and then for an adolescent brain to see so many images and so many videos of themselves and their friends is just probably something that these brains have we've never experienced in the history of our evolution.
I feel like it's getting younger and younger. Now I go to a restaurant
Yeah,
and I see a baby on an iPad
yeah,
because the parents want to enjoy a meal.
yeah. Yes, well, uh, yes, this is interesting because it's not just the baby who has the iPad, it's the parents who are also on their phones. But I would say that just to take a few steps back, we don't know why obviously social media is a contributor, but there has to be other things to just to sort of and I think what's not so satisfying is that we don't know.
Mhm.
But that ultimately it could be a multitude of factors. And I would say that the fact that while the rates are going up, they're disproportionately affecting use of color, LGBTQ, and those in lower income families, which tells you that social determinants of health are also a big driver, not just what use of social media. And I know that there's a significant back and forth between the scientific community about the impact of social media. And I would just sort of, to say it in a sort of a positive, hopeful way, we have science to as our process of eventually finding whether or not the causal mechanisms of whether or not what contributes to what to mental illness. We don't have that yet, but I think there's a lot of debate right now, and we're not going to come up with a satisfying answer of it's definitely TikTok or it's definitely Instagram, but we're going to say it. Obviously, just as an aside, of course, if we spent less screen time, all of us, and did more exercise, we will lead healthier lives and spend more time having person to person social interactions versus those on the screen. So I think we are all in agreement that less screen time is important.
Mhm.
I would say that, just to sort of jump to the conclusion, I would say that what I'm struck by, because I see this at our hospital system, is that those that are coming from these communities that are disproportionately affected by the youth mental health crisis, I think we are always going to have limited resources. We have to figure out how we get to them and to help everyone in our society. We can have a debate about this, but ultimately, we already know by the epidemiology suggests that there are communities that are significantly hurting. That
Is there a do they feel like there's a genetic component or it's more social?
I think it's a great question about genetics. I think that genetics always plays a component, but the genetics in psychiatric disorders is very subtle. Just to give you, I began my career studying genetic variants in psychiatric disorders. I found a few and studied them and studied them. Actually, we would knock in the genetic variants into mice and then study the mice. Yeah, yeah.
Fascinating.
But ultimately, what we came to conclude is that they all can contribute a little bit, but whether if there's not going to be sort of like an aha moment where one genetic variant or one change in one variation will lead to some psychiatric disorder. That said, and I think there was a great study that was actually done by one of my colleagues, Huda Akil at the University of Michigan. She just published this last year, that they were studying these genetic predispositions for depression among University of Michigan freshmen. And it was beautiful that those that were at higher risk because they had sort of a genetic load through something called the polygenic risk score, definitely had a greater chance of exhibiting anxiety and depression during the freshman year, which is a very stressful year for. But during the pandemic, that all went out the window. It no longer mattered. Everyone got depressed. Didn't matter whether you had a predisposition, which tells you that worldwide stresses can trump genetics. So I think genetics are important, but they're not the full.
Genetics loads the gun
Yes,
and then environment pulls the
exactly.
trigger.
Exactly. Yeah. And environmental stresses, especially during the transition from childhood to adolescence, is a big contributor. And we don't know why, but mainly probably because the brain is still developing and forming its sort of connections with other brain regions. And so I think that's what's leading to it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm sure there's been studies, I don't know any off the top of my
Yeah.
head, but of just researching like cortisol levels or what environmental stressors affect people in more low income
Yes,
environments.
there was actually a great study I just was reading the other day by this um, cognitive neuroscientist. Her name is Kate McLaughlin. She's at the University of Oregon. What she did is there was this study called the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. It's called ABCD. It's they have taken 20,000 9-year-olds and followed them longitudinally over they were still following them, but they're now 14, 15 years of age. And what she was able to do was, based on lower income, she could study the brains of those in lower income versus those that were in higher income. And she noticed that there were brain changes. And that the
Really?
hippocampi, or this brain region that's not only involved in spatial learning but also emotional learning, was smaller in those that were come from low income families. But the positive side to this is what's so great about science. So this is a multi-state study funded by the NIH. So she could actually go into the data and look at it and see which states had safety network programs for kids and for parents and families, and those that had safety net um, programs, though the brains of those kids were actually 30% bigger than the ones than non whatever states that didn't have these safety net programs, which tells you that you can move the needle, and you just need to basically have enough resources to do so.
What are the factors, though? It's like diet. I'm thinking if you don't have access to childcare.
And also, I think the human brain and all of us like certainty. And if you're in sort of in environments where there's uncertainty in terms of food security,
Stressors,
you know,
housing
housing,
security.
you know, if you're, you know, those are the things. And so that I think that um, what just to give you an example, I think that throughout the whole pandemic, the reason why we saw such high rates of anxiety, depression is things were so uncertain.
Mm-hmm.
So you can imagine if you live in an environment that is where you are not certain of what the next day will bring, is enormously difficult. That said, um, I think that what what's great about our field is we have certain forms of psychotherapy skills to help kids and adolescents deal with uncertainty. We have there's a form of psychotherapy called cognitive behavioral therapy, where you can have people realize that they can cognitively reappraise a situation, that they can say, like, for example, if you got a bad grade on a test, of course you're going to feel bad, but you can cognitively then realize that maybe I could study more, or this is just one test and among 20 tests I'm going to be taking, and reappraise the situation. And I think this is what we can, as a field, can provide. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah, and also like cortisol levels, it sounds like
yeah.
have an actual effect on brain development.
Exactly. And that if you, and as I said, it's cortisol levels are very important, going up are very important for acute stress. But if you live in these types of environments where there is economic hardship, that sustained stress, your brain can't really sort of withstand that. And they've done elegant studies in both humans and in rodents that with chronic stress, your hippocampus again shrinks, but and then another area of the brain simultaneously expands.
Which
And
is the amygdala?
yes, so the
Which is, can you explain what the amygdala is for my listeners?
yes, so the amygdala is the way I'd like to think about the amygdala. It's the sort of like the seeing eye of the brain. So basically, the amygdala constantly looks out for if you're walking down the street and you see something that looks like a stick, it could be a snake. Your amygdala will basically sort of make
Fight or flight.
exactly. And what's just as an aside, when you're first born, your amygdala runs the brain. So your whole body or your whole sort of being is sort of driven by amygdala responses. And then and the amygdala then teaches and makes connections to the cortex, and essentially teaches the cortex what the world looks like. And then what in this sort of beautiful sort of reciprocity, the prefrontal cortex eventually sends projections back down to the amygdala and then controls the amygdala. And this is what happens during adolescence, where adolescent brains finally have mature prefrontal cortices to control the amygdala. And so what we're saying is that so it is usually thought of, as you said, the fight or flight response, and that during chronic stress, it will actually grow and have more synapses, and it's because it believes that it's under constant threat. Yeah.
So I have borderline personality
Yeah.
disorder,
Yeah.
and they say that the overactive amygdala underactive prefrontal cortex.
No, exactly. That is the core finding in borderline personality disorder found in neuroimaging studies, and that therefore emotional regulation is
It's
difficult.
difficult
Exactly.
on a like biological level. 1/3 of mental health problems manifest by the age of 14 and 75% by age 24. Why is it imperative to intercept these mental health issues in adolescence?
I think if there's one message I would want to say to your listeners would be this is what we need to be able to do. We need to basically intervene as soon as possible as the symptoms emerge because it is a common mantra within medicine that you basically treat symptoms as soon as you see them. If you have a cold or you treat it immediately. If you have diabetes or hypertension, you don't wait 7 to 10 years before you treat it, because after that you're treating a different illness. You're treating end stage hypertension. The average time in our country for someone seeing someone for their psychiatric symptoms is 7 to 10 years, which is that should not happen, right? This, and I think there are many reasons for that, but I would also say that it has something to do with the fact that we don't currently have a vocabulary to describe psychiatric symptoms. The word anxiety with a small a is something we all have during every working day, but anxiety with a capital A, where you're so anxious that you can't go to
Function.
school or you can't go and give a public speaking
You're not
engagement.
eating, you're not
Exactly.
able to sleep.
Exactly. Or that if you are depressed with a small d, where since you had a fight with your roommate, you're not going to feel good for a couple days. But depression with a big D is where you actually can't function, as you said, and have thoughts that life is not worth living, and these other. It's a complete, but these are the exact same words. So I think what our field needs to do is essentially come up with what other aspects of medicine have come up with, which are biomarkers.
And so that's a lot of your research and
Yeah.
your findings. Advanced biologically targeted psychiatric diagnostic tools and treatments that you have been working on and have helped discover. Like,
Yes.
what are those tools? Are they genetic markers?
Yes. So
Okay.
this is a great, I think the youth mental health crisis has really sort of put a spotlight on where we are. I can tell you that just like 20 years ago when I began my lab, we thought that we were going to be just like the rest of medicine, going to be able to find a blood biomarker. We're going to be able to draw a tube of blood, do some genetics or some other. And to this day, we have not succeeded. We have found things that are may put, as you said, put people at risk. But again, it's just sort of loading the gun, not pulling the trigger. So we have lots of those sort of risk factors. But again, that doesn't, in clinical medicine, you need something that is like 90% specific and 90% sensitive to be a biomarker. And I would say that what the work that my collaborator at Weill Cornell, Connor Liston, is doing, I think, is where we're getting a little closer. So essentially, he has found neuroimaging biomarkers. So now instead of drawing a tube of blood, you go and get a scan in an MRI machine. And you now have, and this is where I think we are at this inflection point, because now we have advanced technology, AI, to basically read the scans in a completely different way, even than we did 10 years ago. And he's using machine learning and artificial intelligence to disambiguate just enormous amounts of data coming from these scans. And he's getting closer to basically getting to an algorithm that will be able to do so. And it's still years away, but I think we now have a path forward. And that said, that doesn't mean that um, I bet an MRI scan could, and a psychiatrist could probably make the same diagnoses. It's not like we have difficulty diagnosing depression, but what we don't have a good clue about is how long the depression will last, or what's the best treatment for that depression. And I think this is what these biomarkers will help.
So it's less and less of a guessing game.
Exactly. And that, for example, right now, when I see my patients, I I have to make a decision of which medication to give.
Mhm.
Again, it is based on the algorithm we use is something that's more based on side effect profile than neuroscience. And I think in the future we would like to be able to get to a point where we'd say this brain looks like it will respond to ketamine, and therefore we will give it ketamine and skip all the serotonin reuptake inhibitors for now and go first line with this. And this is where I think we will hopefully get to. Just the same way that if you went to see your cardiologist or your endocrinologist, they have an algorithm that is pretty straightforward.
And so the quicker you kind of intercept these issues or the younger
Yeah,
age
yeah.
is there's the higher rate of actual remission.
Yes, exactly. And because treating a mild symptom is easier than treating a moderate to severe symptom. And
Mhm.
also, I think that we also want to take advantage of the tremendous plasticity in the brain, that it will be much easier to treat a developing brain, with this. And again, I think this gets to what you were saying. We worry about the fact that so many psychiatric disorders and mental illness emerges during this period of time, but it also is a tremendous opportunity because if we intervene, we have a very plastic brain to actually work with and make hopefully long-lasting changes.
And so someone who's listening to this
Yeah,
podcast right now who's a parent who has a loved
yeah.
one, what should we be watching out for?
Uh, that's a great question. What I would say that what you should all be watching out for is to obviously listen to your kids, um, and and if they say they're anxious or depressed, be very mindful of that. But if you see that they are not uh, spending time outside their room, they're not meeting friends. I think one of the biggest risk factors for all psychiatric disorders is social isolation, whether you're a child, adolescent, or adult. And so, if you have someone that's isolating themselves, that's very difficult. The most extreme version of this is what we call school refusal. If they decide that they don't want to go to school, they refuse to go. And for the parents out there, it would be that if your child refuses to go to school, that's probably a big red flag that you need to do something. And the one thing that you probably, in addition to seeing a professional, is that allowing them not to go to school is probably not the right answer. Also, it's sort of the common mantra of cognitive behavioral therapy is that you have to face your fears
And do it anyway.
and do it anyway. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then I feel like there's many parents who are like, "Oh, I just want my child to feel better, so if they're stressed out, I don't want to force them to go to
Exactly.
school."
But I could tell you for in my practice, I see mainly patients with anxiety disorders. And whatever makes a patient anxious, the minute you accommodate them and tell them they don't have to do something, then the anxiety goes away. So it's better than a medication or cognitive behavioral therapy. It's sort of like, well, we remove the anxiety immediately.
Mhm.
I think the best way to, and this is sort of another thing that is sort of hard to explain to everyone, but that when we ask someone to go in to do a couple weeks or several weeks of cognitive behavioral therapy or any psychotherapy, it's sort of like going to a gym. It's no one really wants to go to a gym because it's sort of like stressful and painful to do all that work. But that is actually what is required in order. You have to basically sort of build mental fitness or build resilience in a way, and great, multiple whatever uh, sort of exercise companies have figured out how to incentivize people to go to the gym. So it's possible, and that there are multiple benefits from it, obviously. But that this is what we're asking, that to even there are no quick fixes, and therefore, if you are going to have your child see a therapist, it's not going to be done in a week. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah,
I just want to bounce back
sure,
a little bit for a
yeah,
second, but in adolescence, the onset of mental disorders are occurring at the same time as dramatic biological changes in the
yeah.
brain. Can you discuss what some of those are and the challenges that that interaction could present?
Yes. So I would say that the way to think about neural development is that it's a set of cascades of like of waterfalls, and adolescence is the last cascade. And so this is the period of time when your prefrontal cortex finally starts to wire up with the amygdala and with the prefrontal cortex. And there's some elegant studies showing that this is exactly what's going on. Just and the research that my lab has done and others have done is showing that actually there's a that area of the brain I described before, the hippocampus, actually grows during adolescence. So this is something that it's very sort of counterintuitive. Everyone thinks that everything is sort of pruning and shrinking as you get older, but during adolescence, the hippocampus actually goes through a little growth spurt. And we think that it does that because it's sort of helping the prefrontal cortex essentially learn about the world still. And that therefore we are thinking that in the future we should be able to take advantages of this sort of unique, beautiful development and do things, for example, to take advantage of the hippocampal growth. And the best example, I think, is that there are different forms of psychotherapy, whether you can do it by texting, by telehealth, or in person. And what it suggests is that the adolescent brain probably likes to be to be sort of immersed in a new environment. And so again, why in person or sort of things like even now, some of my colleagues are using virtual reality to basically do different forms of cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's anything that will enrich the prefrontal cortex, I think will, and simultaneously utilize the hippocampus. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's all it seems like much of your work is around this perfect storm, this
Yes.
timing of this children, adolescent, teenage
Yeah.
years, and how mental health issues can
Yeah.
arise during that time
Yeah.
because there's all these biological changes going on.
Yeah.
So we
Oh, by the way, these
discussed.
biological
Oh,
changes are really important and are normal. Just so I can, like an adolescent that is wanting to be more independent and whatever, and sort of pushing against the limits is exactly what they're supposed to do. If you just think about what an 11-year-old has to do and an 18-year-old, both of those are sort of the edges of early adolescence and mid to late adolescence. And just think that an 18-year-old has to actually go off to college and figure out how to wash their own clothes.
we discussed very
Yeah.
briefly before we started the interview, but you oversee one of the largest academic psychiatric programs in the country. What would you like to see implemented? Like, how can we truly make a difference as a society? Like, should there be psychiatric assessments in school, therapy, classes on these things? As someone with BPD who has done a lot of dialectical behavioral
Yeah.
therapy, so much of that is just even naming your emotions.
Exactly.
So many people, myself included, I grew up in a household, sounds like you did
Yeah.
too, where we didn't really talk about mental health.
Exactly.
And if I had anxiety or if I did feel depressed, I honestly didn't even know how to name that or verbalize that to
No,
my
exactly.
parents
Yeah.
because no one talked to me about those things.
Yeah.
So it's like, what are the tools that we can, help educate practitioners, parents,
Yes,
etc.?
we've been thinking about this for the last 5 to 6 years, even before the pandemic, because ultimately, you're right, we have one of the largest psychiatric hospital systems, in New York City, along with, so I sort of oversee Weill Cornell sphere. There's another, we have a partner in Columbia who oversees the Columbia Sphere. So we have probably the two great academic medical schools with New York Presbyterian Hospital, and the question is, how do we impart all this information and also to be able to provide access to all our patients for and parents and education and dissemination of this information. And ultimately we have decided we've put our bets on digital tools, that we think that what we need to do, and we've been spending a significant amount of time thinking about this, but that we are developing a set of self-guided cognitive behavioral therapy apps, symptom trackers, but also instruction manuals for adolescents as well as for parents. We think that this is really important, that we provide sort of, like as you said, a roadmap for our patients and our families. And so what we're going to be doing in this upcoming year is developing all these tools and putting them and disseminating them. I can speak about them freely because we are we are a nonprofit academic institution. We want to disseminate this information and these tools, and what we can do is we can do clinical trials and demonstrate feasibility and efficacy, and that's what our goals are. Because we are nerdy physician scientists and clinician scientists, and this is what we can do. This is what we and But I think ultimately we want to disseminate this, and not just for within New York Presbyterian Hospital, but make it available to everyone. And I just as an example, we're going to be coming up with a parenting program where we will teach parents some of these exact same sort of skills on how to build resilience in kids. This is, I think, something where that doesn't have the same stigma of naming disorders, which, as you know, is can be tremendously inhibiting. But if you can sort of help your kid, like if I would have loved someone to have told me as I was not doing well in my thesis to do some cognitive reappraisal and realize that, that my everything was going to be okay. If I could speak to myself as a 23 or 4-year-old as I was flailing in lab, I would have told. I learned that lesson myself, but it would be great to someone to say that it feels bad now, but you're going to get better, right? And that for each setback you have, there are opportunities to bounce back. You know,
And so those are some of the tools that you're hoping
exactly. Yeah.
to pass along.
Exactly. And
And
do the research to show which tools are the best tools for each person.
mhm.
Like one tool will not fit, will not be sufficient for everyone.
Do you also does your hospital do they train adolescent therapists?
Yes, we have the largest training program for child and adolescent psychiatrists
Okay.
between Columbia and Cornell, um, and we also have programs for clinical psychology training. So we have, but again, as an example, we have in this country, we have 8,000 child and adolescent psychiatrists for a country of 300 million. And we're probably one of the most well resourced countries in the world. And
And not even that. I think I was talking with my boyfriend actually right before this interview, going over some of the questions. And I was saying that most people don't go straight to a childhood or adolescent psychiatrist. They're going to their general practitioner first if
exactly,
if their kid is having
yeah,
issues, and I feel like not every GP will be able to
exactly.
have the tools like
So this is why we think that you're absolutely right. We think that the child and adolescent psychologist or psychiatrist is going to be the person that's going to be seen much later. Hopefully, it will be. And I think again, as you mentioned, actually, there are programs right now where they've embedded social workers and counselors within schools. I think that's the first line because you want to meet the kids where they are, right? And then the next would be in
to
primary care.
alleviate some of the stressors that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. For example, at Weill Cornell, we now are embedding social workers and psychologists within our primary care clinics, and I think this is and where they are able to intervene earlier. And I think this is going to be the ultimate. Uh, that we are the way I think about it is we have to sort of give up our traditional assumptions of how psychotherapy is done. It's not going to be done always face to face in person. It could be done through a digital app. It could be done by social workers and psychologists within a primary care setting or by counselors within schools. I think we just have to be enormously creative. And the last workforce we should always utilize are the parents. Because
Ding ding ding.
if your parents were able to give if they had read the instruction manual that we're coming up with and realized that you have some emotional regulation issues, they could at least name it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
get you help
Yeah.
before.
Or but just even say this is not you being rebellious or whatever. This is something that can be treated. There are good treatments that with lots of evidence behind it, and we just need to intervene now. Yeah.
Is that kind of, I mean, that seems like a hopeful message.
Yeah.
Like these are the 3-point take home of
Yeah.
how we can really help society, how we can move the needle.
Exactly. Utilize all the workforces that we have, and also that ultimately it's, I think, as you know, there we also want to destigmatize what is going on in terms of psychiatric disorders and mental illness. It is a brain problem, and we're finding more and more that there are circuits that are not working so well, but that ultimately that if you can treat it early during this period of time, you can get close to a cure, or at least like in the other fields of medicine, optimal management of hypertension or diabetes or something. You don't have to. It's not something that is going to sort of be catastrophic, and we need to be able to tell people that people are able to overcome depression and anxiety. I think sort of a big change like several years ago was when the president, I think, of Norway made it clear that he had depression. And I think we need more people like you also to be able to be brave
Share your
and
stories.
share stories and realize that the stigmas of 10, 20 years ago are not the same as now, and that we need to all be able to realize that this is something that we all go through at some level, and that if we don't attend to it, it gets worse. It doesn't get better naturally. Having anxiety disorder or depression in childhood or adolescence, it doesn't magically go away.
Well, that's why I love having a neuroscientist
Yeah.
on, because I've always said that we should treat mental disorders the same as we do physical
Exactly.
disorders.
Yeah.
There's no stigma if someone has diabetes and they have to have an insulin pump,
Exactly.
or if someone has a broken leg.
Yeah.
But for some reason, there's these intense stigmas around things that we can't see with the naked eye.
Yeah. Or that there's, again, I think this gets back to how we were talking about the human psyche does not like uncertainty. So if we can't sort of name it with a gene or a sort of like a sort of something very sort of tangible, then it's too mysterious. While we have great treatments for anxiety, depression, especially the psychotherapies, and we have medications that work really well. Again, they're not perfect, but they, in terms of at this point, in terms of especially with the youth mental health um, crisis, I would take good over perfect any day. Yeah.
What are you most excited about in your research and your work at the hospital?
Well, I think what I'm most excited about is that again, I think we're at this inflection point where neuroscience research and technology such as AI and the dissemination of these digital apps, I think, even though they get a bad name, I think provide opportunities that we've never had before. And I would say that again, this I think is sort of more in the sort of the public health dissemination. If Because ultimately it'd be great if we could find the perfect biomarker today, but if we can disseminate evidence-based DBT, CBT to everyone and just get everyone to learn, not go through a course of therapy, but learn the core skills of it, we will just be better off.
It's like sex education,
Exactly. Yeah.
which I used to
Or
do work with, but I'm
yeah,
like, if sex education, just even very basic,
yeah,
minimal level, was in every single school,
exactly. Yeah.
they've done studies, then there's less rates of transmission of STDs, teen pregnancy, la la
Yeah.
la. And it's like the same thing. If we just had a class in school
Yeah.
where you were able to name your emotions
Yeah.
and learn about them, and,
Exactly.
and learn psychoeducation,
Yeah.
what does the brain look like, and the amygdala, hippocampus,
Yeah.
like what all these things do.
Exactly. And we have all the sort of the tools in front of us right now. We have Fitbits, we have sort of like a smartphone that can basically handle any app. And we sort of need that moment, sort of like where someone decides to decide to put it all together and disseminate some sort of toolkit that's going to be. And I think that's what I'm excited about. And then, but always linking it to neuroscience. just to give you an example, we are studying, we've developed our own self-guided CBT app at Weill Cornell. But what I think, this is what makes being at an academic medical center so amazing is that the way we run the clinical trial is we just do the standard efficacy trial, but we do neuroimaging on top of it. So we're actually trying to show that this app changes the connectivity of the brain before and after its use. And I think this is what our field can now do. It would just be unheard of that you could do something like this, showing that you can now use psychotherapy to change connectivity patterns, and using a digital psychotherapy that doesn't involve a person per se. And this is what gets me excited, because then if you think about it, of course, I'm very much worried about New Yorkers because I live here, and New York, and all the patients that are in our system. But you can imagine that there are so many other communities that have no access to any forms of psychotherapy or any forms of evidence-based treatments. And if we can say that what we do here in New York, we can disseminate and give it away for free and do everything and just make it available to that, I think is what the ultimate goal is. Because there's a mantra about physician scientists. We love working at the bench, and we love then taking our findings and putting them on a bookshelf, and not just at the bedside, but ultimately it would be great to do findings and then basically disseminate them to the community. I think that's the
Which
goal.
you can, I feel like, harness social media for that. I mean, even
Yeah,
with a podcast like this,
yeah,
now
yeah,
this will reach
yeah,
tens of thousands of people
yeah,
who wouldn't normally have access to this information.
exactly.
How do we filter out? Right now there's the rise of the
Yeah,
TikTok therapist, and
yeah,
I do see a lot of information that is inaccurate or isn't backed
yeah.
by studies, isn't backed by a real hospital, by education systems. How can someone navigate that?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question, because you're right. There, the more easily accessible sort of information sources, such as the people on TikTok, or are always not providing the information that is completely accurate. While as academics, we put our information on sort of static websites, which are completely accurate, and but no one will read the flip through the 20 web pages to read through all this. And I think this is a great sort of project for the future of how can thought leaders and people that know the evidence base be able to disseminate this. And I think this is why I admire what you've been doing so much, in terms of, because you bring people on the show who basically are people that do care about the evidence base, and making sure that they are saying the things that are accurate and are going to be helpful, and not whatever, and not hurtful in any way.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah,
I'm that's very important to
yeah,
me. I am obviously not a
yeah,
doctor, have
yeah,
never claimed to be
yeah,
one. And so I absolutely want to elevate, the work that people are doing in the field
yeah,
who have years
yeah,
and
yeah.
decades behind them,
Yes.
Um,
But I think within our field, we can do more. So I think what you point out is great, is that we can do more to disseminate this information. Just for example, the best information about all these disorders are on websites such as for the National Institute of Mental Health,
mhm.
or so, and other foundations that, for example, National Association of Mental Illness, NAMI. But no one wants to go to those. They'd rather
Yeah,
just
it's like, how
immediate.
can we make it fun and interesting as
Yeah,
much as like a 30-second little TikTok video? I mean,
yeah,
I even struggle with it myself when it comes to this podcast.
yeah,
Not everyone just goes on the podcast app or the Spotify to listen to the entire hour
yeah,
interview.
yeah.
They look at a 30-second clip on Instagram or TikTok, and they say, "Oh, that piques my interest. Now I'll go listen."
Yes, exactly.
Um,
So it's almost like what you're talking about, and this is what we've been thinking a lot about, is we need sort of like a funnel, right? How do you get people to then, sort of like getting people to work out in a gym? Like,
yeah.
how do you get people to decide that they need to put the work in to basically, that if you're having some issues, you will need to sort of invest time and do things that are not going to be comfortable, but are ultimately going to pay dividends.
Yeah, and it
Yeah.
sounds like there's almost two parts of it, because there's like, you're going to the parents, teachers,
Yeah.
therapists,
Yeah.
psychiatrists, and then you're going out to the general
Yeah.
public. And those are kind of, obviously, it's all needs to be accurate, but you're almost
Yeah.
training those people. And then these people, you're just putting out the information saying, do with
Yes.
it what you will. And just knowledge is power. And the more educated you are on these
Exactly.
subjects, you
Yeah.
can make informed decisions.
Yes, but ultimately, you're right. We live in an era of information overload. So
Mm-hmm.
how do you get this type of information? And I think ultimately, as sort of as a scientist, I think that what will capture the attention of the public is, and this is incumbent on our field, is we need to make. We need to basically show that we have done something that has been sort of categorically or qualitatively advanced. Yeah, we need to capture the imagination of the public, that we have now been able to disseminate some intervention that has moved the needle on something. Like, for example, that study that I mentioned by Kate McLaughlin on the social determinants of health and the brain imaging. I mean, that was published in a Nature journal. But again, no one read that because it's a technical article, but it's something that people should know about, because it tells you that we could affect policy, right, if in certain ways to help the developing brain in many ways.
Yeah, quick question just
Yeah.
coming off of that, but you obviously oversee all of this hospital that
Yeah.
has
Yeah.
what, 10 or 11
Yeah.
institutions
Yeah.
inside of it, or
Yeah.
hospitals inside the institution. At what point are you changing kind of what's being taught in to doctors and in med school, which then trickles down to, high school, grade school?
I think that right now we definitely are those that are getting trained in our residency programs and our fellowship programs are learning all of this. But again, that's the long game, right? In terms of, but I think that what is absolutely needed is we need even a bigger workforce than just the residents and the fellows. We need psychology interns and others to basically also know about the nuts and bolts of the evidence base that's out there, and to be able to disseminate this. I, yeah.
So what can people who are listening to this podcast, what can they do? Just make sure they're sharing accurate information that's like,
I would say that what they can do is, as they're reading I think that there seems to be lots of sort of absolutisms out there right now in terms of whether whatever social media is all good or bad or something. And ultimately, what I think would be helpful is for them to um, read or go to reputable podcasts like yours and basically have experts on. And I think you're right. I think it's hard for people to read more than 3 pages on a website.
well, I think,
Yeah.
yeah. And I mean, you can talk about the brain chemistry component with that, of
Yeah.
why, there's studies on studies of why our memories, attention span, why we're the ADD,
Yeah.
ADHD generation, and the dissemination of information
Yeah.
almost at a constant rate.
Yeah.
And also just like our news. Like, I wonder if just collectively as a society, our cortisol levels are higher these days, because it just seems like before you would have obviously horrible things happening in the world, but I feel like it wasn't so in your face all the time
Yeah.
like it is now.
Yeah. I don't have a theory. My colleague Richard Friedman and George McCary, who are at Cornell, wrote an article in the Atlantic, and I think I would recommend your readers read this. Is that to answer this is that something happened during the COVID epidemic. We categorically changed as a society because it was probably one of the biggest stresses that any of us have gone through. And we can't really just, it's now a new normal that we live in. and that, but we should at least acknowledge that what we're going through right now and sort of the knock-on effects of the pandemic are still with us. And saying that, because I think most of us want to forget that there's a pandemic. The human mind works in a certain way where we thank God that's over. Let's now just move forward and look ahead. But I think what it's saying is that we basically categorically changed as a society to some degree, and that this is something that we need to attend to, and and also, as you noted, or as I've noted to my colleagues, that we also learned something about how our society consumes information about science. That somehow there was this big debate about whether to wear a mask or not, and about vaccines. So I think it opened up and revealed certain things about our society, and you can't sort of see them anymore. And I think this is something that I think we are still in sort of a post-COVID sort of recovery period in terms of how our society is sort of trying to come back together. It
Mm-hmm.
really was something that sort of revealed fractures in our society, and I think this is why everyone feels, as you said, continually stressed at this moment. Yeah.
Are you nervous about like the use of are you a parent yourself?
Yes, I
Okay.
have two daughters. Yeah.
But like even in raising your kids,
Yeah.
as a neuroscientist, are you skeptical or protective over the use of like social media, phones, the front facing camera, the things we're
Yeah.
talking about, even the use of AI? You're saying,
Yeah.
like there's these amazing things you can now do,
Yeah.
scanning these brain images and
Yeah.
deciphering it. But at the same time, it's scary where our world is heading.
Yes, I completely agree, and I think that what I would say, as a parent of my daughters are in their early 20s, but so they're still in that sensitive period, but almost complete with their adolescence. But I would say that what I've always emphasized is that the more time you can spend with your friends and with your teachers and with the people, with your network of that support network, that's actually the most important thing. And because then if you do that, then these things that are taking so much center stage right now in terms of TikTok and social media don't matter so much if you have this sort of core group of connectiveness. And I think this is what our society needs to remember, that ultimately, as all of us who went from Zoom meetings to in-person meetings
Mm-hmm.
realized that it's so much better to, like, for example, where you and I were talking before this, that we could have done this podcast via Zoom, but it's so much better to do it in person for 10,000 other reasons. And again, it's much better to see your friend in person than and have a coffee than have a meeting by Zoom with them.
Or a
Yeah.
phone call.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is important, but in many ways, this is, I think, and I think this is not just something that affects young, adolescents and young adults, but I think that as you probably seen in the newspapers, everyone talks about an epidemic of loneliness among older adults, and that actually one of the new sort of not trends, but new sort of advances in treating older late life depression is to actually have people engage in social interactions, and that itself is probably more therapeutic than other things, and that just engaging and connecting with others is actually probably much more important. And because you can imagine, just think about how much your brain has to work to figure out all the social cues in an in-person interaction, and also having to go somewhere to do this. As an example, I enjoyed riding the Q train here and going to Chinatown, to do the podcast, because just and changed the pattern of my day, which is, I think, really important. So, I normally don't go to Chinatown in the middle of the day.
I did a podcast like a week ago, and we were talking about these people in Silicon Valley who created
Yeah,
the iPhone or created
yeah,
Facebook or
yeah.
work at these places. um they most of them don't even let their children use them, or they go to these schools in Silicon Valley where you're not allowed to have a cell phone at school. You
Wow.
can't be checking
Yeah,
it midday or in between
yeah,
classes. um and so yeah, I think what you're doing is amazing,
mm,
and
mm.
it's kind of, yeah, we have all of these things
Yeah,
at
yeah,
play, and how can each I feel like we live in a very individualistic society
yeah,
more and more, and it's
yeah,
about the individual and less about
yeah,
community. And, like raising children together and
yeah,
looking out for each other's children.
yeah.
And I think we need to remember that at the end of the day, we like to be empathetic and that we're all humans.
No, exactly. And that ultimately, what we want our kids to learn is to find out what's meaningful in life. And the only way you can do that is by interacting with others and trying to find meaning in social interactions and social groups and doing things that are actually truly involving a community, as you said, right?
And do you feel like in your lifetime, like we will be able to obviously not cure
Yeah.
everything, but get to a place where, you know, maybe the crisis can reduce a little?
I am an optimist, and I think in the next few years, if we are smart and we sort of do things the way the trajectory is set up, we should be able to treat more people. We should be able to leverage the resources we have and move the needle. I really believe that, and also I think that what is also helpful is I think there is a more open conversation that's going on in society, that this is something that needs to be attended to, that we cannot not talk about it in a
Yeah.
way, and that that the spotlight is here, and we have a, just like with many things, we have a limited time while the spotlight is on, and it is incumbent upon my colleagues, but also those around us, to basically do everything we can right now. I believe there's a certain level of urgency to this, because we we need,
Strike when the iron's hot.
yes, exactly, and get everyone who wants to be involved to put their voice in, because again, it's not just what we as academics sitting in a institution are thinking. It's like, what is going on out there, and what can we do to help in a
Yeah.
way? Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
absolutely. I
yeah,
really appreciate you coming down in the
yeah.
middle of a Monday to come on the podcast.
And thank you for all you do also by having this podcast. The fact that you're doing this um, every week is amazing, and a labor of love, I know. Yeah,
Thank you so
yeah.
much.